so much, everybody, for joining us here this afternoon for our fourth and final webinar in our series, Phenomena in Practice. Today, we're going to be talking about building assessments that measure NGSS proficiency. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. Now, Julie and I will go ahead and return the favor. So my name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years here in Minnesota prior to working at InterOrbit. I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular chem, honors chem. So I had a lot of opportunities to teach a lot of different kids in a lot of different ways. I worked a lot with the NGSS while I was in the classroom, as well as being a PLC lead, and I got to lead a lot of data-driven dialogue. And today we get to dive into some data, which I'm so excited to show you all. And now I have the joy of partnering with districts to help them implement InterOrbit. And speaking of Halloween, I love anything chocolate-based when it comes to Halloween candy. Particularly, I just like a plain Hershey's bar, honestly, but then I also like Reese's Peanut Butter Cups and Kit Kats. The problem is those are also my children's favorite Halloween candies, so I don't know how much I will be able to do the parent tax, if you know what I'm talking about. And with that, I would like to pass the introductions over to my colleague, Daniel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Jackson, he, him. I was previously a curriculum director, high school biology and middle school science teacher for about 11 years in education. I taught at an international school in Colombia. I was a global education and Fulbright scholar in Morocco. And currently I partner with school leaders and teachers new to InterOrbit. And today I will be in the chat to help you. If you have any questions, I'll be there to help you with that. And for Halloween, Skittles, lemon heads. I really like sweet, sugary candies. And like Emily, Reese's, but really Reese's anything. And I'll pass it on to my colleague, Julia.
Thank you, Daniel. I see that Reese's are famous here. I'm not a fan, but my name is Julia. I was a teacher and a tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic for about 4 years, and I've been supporting teachers and districts with their NGSS implementation now for the last 4 years. And I've been able to partner and provide guidance to schools and districts implementing assessments in their NGSS instruction. I know this is a weird take, but almond joys are my favorite Halloween candy. If you think the same way, drop it in the chat. Say you also love almond joys. Don't be shy. Emily and Daniel, when they saw this, they were like, terrible. Why would you do this? Daniel was like, it's kind of okay. But yes, I think those are the best. That is the best Halloween candy ever. Cool. All right. So let's actually get into the content for today. And we're going to talk about building assessments that measure NGSS proficiency. And today, we hope that at the end of the webinar, you will understand a way to measure NGSS proficiency using data from summative, three-dimensional assessments centered around novel phenomena. And we're going to be here for about 30 minutes. Today, we're going to go first over what is InterOrbit. Then we're going to go over some definitions with summative assessments, as we always do, and over some NGSS terminology, so we're all on the same page. Then Emily is going to walk us through a summative assessment example. We're going to go over what is proficiency and some summative data analysis, just to see what that is. And finally, we're going to wrap up and get you out of here. Isn't that phenomenal? Well, it certainly is. And just to get us started, let's talk a little bit about what is InterOrbit. So InterOrbit is an NGSS assessment report and practice platform for science educators, and we have grade levels 3 through 12. Provide high integrity 3D assessments that give you meaningful and actionable student data. So at its core, InterOrbit starts with phenomena that are real world events that students can connect with, and these anchor every assessment so learning feels relevant and authentic. From there, we also have three-dimensional assessments that let students demonstrate what they know and how they think. And finally, educators and districts get powerful reports that surface 3D learning data aligned to state tests, helping them make informed decisions. We also make the NGSS accessible for both you and your students. And we know that navigating the 3 dimensions of the standard can be overwhelming, so we focus on supporting innovative sense-making every step of the way. We have scaffolded question types, 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, and 3-dimensional, and educators have total flexibility of choosing the types of questions that they want to include in their assessments. And InterOrbit is also expanding how we help educators turn assessment data into action. So it's not just collecting scores, it's about using them to drive instruction and support student growth. And finally, we empower science educator with the guidance, supporting resources, and professional development needed to confidently navigate 3D assessments. And we go beyond just the platform. We are constantly sharing best practices through free webinars like this one, personalized support, and professional development that helps you build a strong foundation in 3D assessment. So if you're interested in learning more about Inner Orbit and trying it on your own, my colleague Daniel is going to drop a link in the chat, and you can fill this form out, and we'll reach out with additional information. Now, let's dive into the content of our webinar. And to start, let's start with what sense making is and what is the role that plays for summative assessments. So sense making occurs when students are connecting their previously developed ideas, abilities, and experiences together to address uncertainty presented in the phenomenon. So sense making at the end of the day is putting together those dimensions, the SCPs, the DCIs, and the cross-cutting concept tied to a phenomena or problem that is novel for students, for them to actually engage in that authentic uncertainty that is sense making. We have about 3 criteria to know that students are really engaging in sense making. First, is the phenomena that we're using novel? Then, are we using the 3 dimensions? Are the DCIs, SCPs, and cross-cutting concepts included in the questions and in the tasks that we're asking students to engage with? And finally, are students grappling with uncertainty? So many times, students only experience one phenomena in a unit. And it's important to know, maybe that's the anchoring phenomena. As we see here, the Open Syed maple tree anchoring phenomena that Emily's, I think, is going to go over that unit later on. But when we do that, it can look like students are learning science only in that scenario. And many times students are just memorizing what that phenomena is. So for students to really practice applying what they're learning to the world around them, we must give them multiple opportunities to make sense of that novel phenomena. And the way that they get practice is transferring. And we, as educators, can assess for true science understanding with multiple phenomena throughout the unit. Today, we're actually going to focus on summative assessments and the phenomena that we would use for specific summatives, but we have previous webinars on YouTube about sense-making practices and formative assessments too. So if you're interested in those, you can visit our YouTube page and see what they're about. Now, before we dive deeper, let's take a moment to talk about NGSS terminology, specifically the PE, or the performance expectation. And unlike traditional standards that often focus on isolated facts or skills, a performance expectation is telling us what students should be able to do to demonstrate their understanding. And every PE integrates all 3 dimensions of the NGSS, the DCI, the SCP, and the cross-cutting concept. And we can see that in the example below, how all 3 of these dimensions come together into one performance-based outcome. So students aren't just recalling facts, they're making sense of phenomena and showing their thinking in action, which at the end of the day is the heart of 3D assessment. And we know that now that we know what a performance expectation is, we're going to talk about how to assess it too. So to truly meet a performance expectation, as we said before, students need to answer questions that integrate all 3 dimensions of the NGSS. And we call these 3-dimensional questions because they require students not just to know about science, but to do science and think like scientists. So the act of putting all these things together, as I mentioned before, with a phenomena or problem is called sense making. But getting students to that point takes intentional scaffolding. And that's where 1-dimensional and 2-dimensional questions come in. So a 1-dimensional question will focus just in one dimension, like content knowledge, or a DCI only question. 2-dimensional questions brings in 2 dimensions, like the content and the practices, or the content and the cross-cutting concepts. And the 3-dimensional question will integrate all 3 dimensions, requiring students to apply their knowledge, use scientific reasoning, and connect ideas across concepts. And these 3-dimensional questions are the ones that will actually let us know if students are meeting the performance expectation. But using this progression from 1-dimensional to 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional not only supports students in building deeper understanding, but it will also give educators a clear pathway to develop sense-making skills over time. Now moving on to define summative assessments and take a look at them specifically. They're all about measuring whether students have reached proficiency with the NGSS by the end of instruction. And the purpose of a summative assessment is to assess 3-dimensional understanding once learning is complete, whether that's after a lesson, after a unit, or even a full course. And the design of these assessments goes beyond surface level recall. We see both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional multiple choice questions, as well as maybe 3-dimensional free response questions that push students to demonstrate sense making, not just select the right answer. And the goal here is to determine if students can integrate all 3 NGSS dimensions, the GCI, SCP, and cross-cutting concept to make sense of novel phenomena. And that's what we mean by proficiency. Not just knowing the content and not just knowing practice in isolation, but bringing all of these things together to explain or model something that is unfamiliar to students. And inter-orbit summative assessments are designed to do exactly that. So they give teachers clear evidence of students' growth and give districts reliable data aligned to the performance expectations. And when we talk about implementing these three-dimensional assessments and these summative assessments, we know it's not a one-size-fits-all journey. And that's why at InterOrbit, we support educators with 3 different tailored pathways, or what we call assessment orbits, designed to help you build towards full NGSS proficiency, no matter where your team is starting. And today we're focusing on the assess and analyze part of our cycle, specifically with summative assessments. And these ties into InterOrbit's assessment orbits that support 3D instruction by helping you identify the right entry point for your team, whether you're starting with sense-making practice or individual assessments, or maybe even common assessments. But today's focus is how novel phenomena in summative assessment will provide the data that we need to measure NGSS proficiency and how you can use the data to drive next steps in your instruction. And now, without further ado, Emily's actually going to show you how a summative assessment is really structured with an example. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you for staying with us while we review some of that fundamental knowledge about the NGSS and about assessments, just to make sure that we are all good to go and on the same page. So what I'm going to be showing you all today is an example of a summative assessment that was built on InterOrbit. So for this example, I am looking at an Open SciEd curriculum, the unit within 7th grade, and the unit 7.4, which is about matter cycling and photosynthesis. If you've been here with us for this webinar series, this is the same unit that we have been using within different examples. This particular unit has 4 different unit standards, and this unit is all about matter and energy cycling through a system, and the anchoring phenomena is about maple syrup. So this idea of where does the maple syrup come from the tree? How does this maple syrup, where does it come from? How does it get created? And then it goes into our bodies as food. And then what does it do in our bodies and how this cycle continues? So as Julia mentioned, a summative assessment would be used at the end of instruction in order to measure proficiency at that point. So if you're utilizing InterOrbit and you want to build a summative assessment around this particular unit, you would need to be assessing the 4 performance expectations that were taught within the unit. So you could go onto InterOrbit, and with our tiles, you could click on curriculum and you could click Open SciEd. You could click the 7.4 matter cycling unit, and then you could look at our pre-made summative assessments that we have already pre-built. When you click this, you are actually going to see 4 different pre-made summatives appear, because there were 4 different performance expectations taught within this unit. As you can see, this one is about MSLS 1.6, MSLS 1.2, MSPS 1.3, etc. And each one of these is 4 questions long. So they're short, just targeting that one performance expectation. But if you wanted to build a summative assessment on the entire unit, what you could do is go into each of these pre-mades, and there's a button on our site that lets you use all questions. And what you can do is you can build together an assessment using all 4 of these pre-made summatives to create one final summative assessment. So as you can see here, this final summative assessment is 16 questions long, pulling 4 questions from each of the pre-made summatives from the 4 different performance expectations. Now, what this is going to look like for students is they're going to be engaging with 4 different novel phenomena, and each novel phenomena is going to be focusing on a different performance expectation. And again, if you've been with us during this series, you know that having students interact with a novel phenomena is the best way to see if they're truly engaging with sense making, because we want to have them grappling with uncertainty, with something new that they haven't seen before, to see if they can transfer their previously learned knowledge and ideas that you've taught them, maybe through the maple syrup anchoring phenomena, to see if they can apply that somewhere else. So I wanted to show you guys a little bit of a deeper dive on what this might actually look like. So for this deeper dive, I'm just going to show you 4 questions from one of the performance expectations. So just as a reminder, there are 4 performance expectations within this unit. So we're just going to zoom in and look at one of them. So if we're looking at MSLS 1.6, The 4 questions that were used in this pre-made summative assessment are going to be a 2D cross-cutting concept question, a 2D SEP, and a 3D and 2 3D multiple choice questions. So students first will be presented with the phenomena in question that they're going to be engaging with. And then the 4 questions, like I mentioned, there's going to be a 2-dimensional cross-cutting concept question where they're going to be layering in the content with the CCC, a 2-dimensional question where they're laying in the content, but now with the SEP, and then 2 3-dimensional sense-making questions, which is truly at the heart of what we want students to be able to do and engage with. Now, what's nice about offering a variety of question types with students is when we look at the data here in a little bit, we can then use the data to see which elements of the standards students may be needing a little bit more support with. And the one thing that we really want to point out here at this point with summative assessments is we are only focusing on 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional questions. We are removing that 1-dimensional scaffolding of a DCI only question. And the idea with that is at this point, students should be able to start working with multiple dimensions together with that novel phenomena. So if we truly want to get an understanding of their proficiency and what they understand, we want to be able to remove those content-only questions and see if they can start integrating other dimensions at the same time. Another thing that I wanted to share with you all is on Inner Orbit, we also offer free response questions. So this is looking at the exact same phenomena that we were just looking at before. And now this is an example of a 3-dimensional free response question that is on our site as well. And these are particularly nice to have your students engage and experience with, especially if you have a state test that has free response questions as a part of them. The other nice thing that we have on our site is all of our free response questions, while they do need to be teacher graded, everything else is auto graded, we do provide you with a rubric to help you with the grading. And the rubric actually breaks down the score each individual dimension. So this can help both you as the educator and your students see how all 3 dimensions are working together within this one question. So you can go ahead and score students individually on how do they understand the content. So like, do they understand this idea of matter and cycling? Do they understand how to construct explanations and design solutions? And can they look through that lens of how all of this is interconnected? Because all of these are different skills and are different aspects that students would utilize to answer this question. We're giving them an opportunity to assess them individually on each of those with this rubric. So now that we've taken a little bit of time to actually look at an example of a 3-dimensional summative assessment on Inner Orbit, before we take a dive into the data that is then produced as a result of giving that assessment, I want to take some time just to talk about what is proficiency. This is a word that is used a lot in education. So are our students proficient? Are they reaching towards proficiency? And there's a lot of different ways to view and look at this. So the lens that I want to bring you all with is how state tests tend to measure proficiency. So the first thing I want to do is just anchor us all on what the NGSS says is proficiency. So the definition of proficiency by the NGSS is student proficiency is a 3-dimensional performance in which the student uses a core idea, the DCI, science and engineering practice, the SEP, and cross-cutting concept, CCC, together to address a given context or phenomena. So that's the sense making that we've been talking about. Now, if you look at proficiency in terms of an NGSS state test, and so what I mean by that would be the state test given within your state that is science-based. So like in California, it's the CAST. In New York, it could be the Regents. In Maryland, it's the MISA. They all have different fun names. A lot of these state tests use a proficiency scale of 1 to 4. So at the end of the day, a student will either be assigned a 1, 2, 3, or 4 based on how they performed on that assessment. And generally speaking, a 3 is marked as proficient. A 4 would be above proficiency, a 2 would be not quite there yet, and then a 1 would be not meeting proficiency. Those are loose terms. So what's tricky here is as educators who are giving these assessments, the data that we usually get back is percentages. So at what rate did my students answer these questions correctly or not? And it can be hard to translate that to that 1 through 4 scale. So what happened here over at Inner Orbit is we conducted a research project. And we were curious if Inner Orbit's summative assessment scores align with NGSS state proficiency levels. So essentially, we wanted to know if students take summative assessments on Inner Orbit, could that be predictive in seeing how they would perform on a state NGSS test? So in order to do this research, what we did, I'm going to walk you through a direct example of what we did for this research project. We're going to start by looking at the CAST, which is the California Science Test. So if you look here, according to the CAST, for 8th grade, the minimum score a student could get on the CAST is a 350, and the maximum score they could get is a 450. So there's a total range of points. There's a total of 100 points available for a student to score on the CAST. And then here are the score ranges that they share for those different proficiency scales, a 1, 2, 3, and 4. So as you can see, there's different ranges that are acceptable for each of those scores. So if you like math and you like statistics, hang with me for a sec. If you don't, take a minute. I'll show you a nice little easy chart here in just a sec. So level 3 is this proficiency. So students have reached proficiency if they receive a level 3 traditionally on NGSS state tests. So when we're looking at that level 3, what we did here at Inner Orbit is we looked at the minimum score a student would have to get in order to receive that number. So for example, the minimum score to get a 1 would be 0 points. The minimum number of points to score to get a 2 is 28, for a 3 it is 65, and for a 4 it is 83. Now, if you remember, there was a total of 100 points available because the range is from 350 to 450. So what we did is we simply took that minimum score and we divided it by 100 to get what we call a cut score. So the Inner Orbit cut score for the 8th grade CAST, now this only works for the 8th grade CAST, I'll show you some more examples in a moment, is 65%. So what that means is if students score a 65% potentially on an Inner Orbit assessment, that could align to getting a 3 on the CAST. And I really wanted to point this out to all of you because especially having been a science teacher in the classroom, when we see 65%, we usually think that's a D. That is 5 percentage points away from an F. This is proficient? Yes. And when you look at other states, the percentages can actually range quite a bit. So for example, these are all of the cut scores for California, for 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th. Notice we're at 64, 65%. For Oklahoma, for 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade, we're at about 50%. For New York, for 5th grade and 8th grade, we're at about 44% and 42%. And for Maryland, we are at about 50%. Now, these are only 4 states. There are many others. Daniel has now gone, thank you, Daniel, and dropped in the chat a resource on our site where you can see other states' cut scores that have been calculated. I do want to be very clear that all of these states use different metrics to help come up with this cut score percentage, which is why they are all different. They all have different standards. They all have different metrics that they are using. But what's nice for this is to give you a frame of reference when looking at your data, especially if you're used to that 90, 80, 70, 60 split. Because again, 50%, 40% in a traditional A through F scale, that's failing. But in terms of these scores, these would be considered proficient. And so when you're looking at data, particularly on Inner Orbit, we want you to have this new lens to look at the numbers and then use these numbers to help inform and guide your instruction for potential next steps to help students reach proficiency. I did want to share, since I already mentioned the research project, the results we got as a result of doing the research within the research project. So we looked at 3 different states and did 4 different case studies. So we looked at an Oklahoma 11th grade test, a Connecticut 8th grade test, a California 8th grade test, and a California 5th grade test. And what we saw is that there was an average alignment of 97%, with no alignment less than 90%, between Inner Orbit summative assessments compared to how students did on their state NGSS test. So when we use those cut scores and compared how students did on an Inner Orbit test, on average, it was 97% aligned with how they then did on their state test. If you like numbers and data, here's a little zoom in for you. What's nice with this is that we saw this strong alignment between these two, and so you can hopefully use Inner Orbit to help be a predictive source to see how your students are doing on their road to proficiency for that state test. And then you can use the detailed data on Inner Orbit to help inform your instruction for those next steps. Daniel's going to go ahead and drop in the chat a link to this research project in case you are interested in learning more. But thank you for going down a little statistical data number hole with me. Now I actually want to show you some data that could actually be produced as a result of a summative assessment, keeping that new lens in mind on what proficiency is. So as a reminder, we had built a summative assessment for Unit 7.4, which had 4 different performance expectations in it. Now, as I'm doing my data deep dive, I'm going to show you a deep dive into the SCPs and the CCCs for 2 reasons. One, the SCPs and the CCCs come up a lot. So not just within one grade level or within one unit, but they're something that continuously pops up regardless of grade level, regardless of content. And so seeing how students are doing on those can be a really great way to help support students in order to start being more comfortable with the NGSS and that transfer. So when I'm looking at the SEPs, 2 of the performance expectations actually had developing and using models. So we're going to focus on that. Another one had constructing explanations and designing solutions. And another had obtaining and evaluating and communicating information. So we're going to look at those 3 SCPs. Now, when it comes to the cross-cutting concepts, 2 of them had energy and matter, flow cycles and conversation, and 2 of them had structure and function. It's almost like these were all related in a unit or something. So those are going to be the 2 CCs that we do a deep dive and focus with. So the first report that I'm going to be showing you here is our inner orbit dimensions report. And this is my favorite report that we have. What this allows you to do is it allows you to see overall how students are performing on questions that are tagged with this SEP. So if the SEP of constructing explanations and designing solutions is being assessed, overall students are getting about 56% of those questions correct. But our data can go even further. You can see particularly the grade levels that those questions are tied to, and you can specifically see what element of that SEP was being assessed. Because when it comes to constructing explanations and designing solutions, there's a lot to being able to accomplish that SCP. So we can actually tell you which elements of the SCP were 1, being assessed, and 2, how students are doing on them. We can also do the same thing with developing and using models and obtaining and evaluating communicating information. And I just want to remind you really quick, you see that 66%? You see that it's green? That's because about that 65% with the cast in California is around proficient. So again, just to kind of change your lens. But what's interesting here is if you can see obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information overall is a 66%. But when I particularly look at middle school, it's actually at an 18%, which means in the other grade level bands, it seems that students are doing better. And so this actually might be an area where I want to target some support. Because really at the end of the day, what we're hoping our reports can do for all of you is inform instruction and inform next steps. Not to have this be the final step, but to continue the cycle and decide what can I do next to help support my students, reassess them to see if we've moved the needle and if they progressed, and then to continue on. And like I said, you can also do the same thing with the cross-cutting concepts here as well. So we can see how they're doing on energy and matter, and we can also see how they're doing on structure and function. And notice how we have different aspects of the cross-cutting concepts appearing here as well. So students are doing a little bit better about the transfer of energy can be tracked as energy flows than they are within a natural design system. The transfer of energy drives the motion or cycling of matter. So that's where, again, you can get that targeted support based on how they're doing. And not only can you just look at this dimensions report for your students, you can also look at this information via a district report. So if you are at a district admin level, you can go ahead and see the same information by school site, which can be really useful to identify any patterns or trends that are occurring within the district. If your entire district needs support with a particular SEP, you can go ahead and design some professional development around that. If you have one school site that is particularly a standout within one SEP, it might be worth going and reaching out to those teachers and talking to them and seeing what they're doing to support students and see if they have some amazing ideas that they've been implementing that you can bring out to the rest of the district. And this report can be used for the SEPs, the CCCs, and the DCIs as well. If this is something that seems interesting to you and something that you potentially want to explore more, Daniel is going to go ahead and drop in that interest form in the chat one more time. This interest form is letting us know that you are potentially interested in maybe conducting a pilot of Inner Orbit. Our pilots are free, and it gives you a chance to access Inner Orbit and see if this may be a good fit for you and your team before trying to decide if you would like to evaluate it further. So filling out that interest form, you're not committing to anything. Essentially, you're committing to getting an email from us saying like, hey, you said you wanted to learn more. How can I help you with some resources and information? So feel free to fill that out if you would like to. Woof! That was a lot of information about summative assessments, a lot of math, a lot of data, a lot of numbers. And Julie is going to go ahead and give us a nice little recap before we go ahead and end here.
Well, thank you, Emily. And thank you everyone for sticking around. I know we went over 4 minutes over, but I'm glad to wrap us up so we can leave here today with some learnings. So today we learned that in order to be proficient with the performance expectation, students need to answer questions that utilize the DCI, the SAP, and the cross-cutting concepts all together about a novel phenomena, and how important it is to remove those scaffolds that are DCI only and to not include those when we're actually assessing student proficiency. We focused on the assess and analyze portions of our cycle. And we understood that sometimes, even though scores may look like 60%, 50%, it might mean that our students are really proficient depending on what our state cut scores are. So now that we've done all of this, I'm really excited to share one more time, or Daniel just dropped it in the chat actually. If you're interested in piloting in an orbit and really learning more about it, please feel free to fill out that form. It'll just give you access for a month. If you like this type of content, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at In Orbit NGSS. We upload every single webinar that we do, and we have content not only from the foundations of the NGSS, but also sometimes even state-specific content if you're looking for things that are specific to your state. And if you have any other questions, you can always email us at inquiries@inorbit.com. And that's it for today. Thank you so much. And again, we're really grateful for your presence throughout all of these webinars, throughout all these webinar series.
Thank you again, everybody, so much for being here with us this afternoon. It's always a joy to see who's joining us and to hopefully give you some helpful information.